Joining me today, Congressman Reschenthaler from the 14th Congressional District. Always good to hear from you. How are you, Congressman?
Good, Rose. Please call me Guy, and thanks for having me back on. I appreciate it.
It's always good to have you on, and as always, we enjoy getting updates from you. There's a lot to talk about this week. One of the big things that happened this week, midweek, was the USMCA taking effect. And, this is the post-NAFTA trade era, and that's very significant for a lot of reasons. And there are a couple of different differences between NAFTA and USMCA. Do you want to talk about some of those right now and why you are excited about this?
Rose, I'd love to. So USMCA is a big win for the American worker, the guy that's working in a manufacturing plant, the American farmer. It's a really good thing for the United States, and I'll explain why. For one, it levels the playing field between trade with the United States, Canada, and Mexico. It requires that in Mexico, the workers have to be paid a certain level of money. So we won't see jobs leaving for south of the border where Mexican workers are not getting paid livable wages. So it does that. It also puts environmental standards on Mexican companies, which again levels the playing field, because if manufacturers have to deal with that level of regulation here in the United States, then it's unfair to have Mexico go without these environmental protections. So that's one issue. The other thing is that when you look at points of origin with components, for example, cars, it's going to increase the amount of components that have to originate in the United States to be deemed acceptable to be labeled an American car, which is going to be a big win for manufacturing, especially, of course, in our automobile industry as well as others. And then farming, it's a really big win for the American farmer because it's going to open up the Canadian market to dairy. Right now, Canada subsidizes and has price controls on their dairy products. So it's not even competitive for our farmers to send dairy products into Canada. So that market is going to open up to the American farmer, and so is poultry. So chicken, eggs, turkey, for example. We're going to be able to sell these products in Canada. So that's just some of the highlights, but it's a big win all the way around. And Rose, if you just let me, this is also a big deal for us in how we react to China. And I'll explain that. Right now, the trade that we have between the United States, Canada, and Mexico is roughly 1/3 of the trade that we have with all our trading partners. So if we have strong ties, if we've locked down free trade agreements with our two biggest trading partners, it gives us much more maneuverability and leverage when dealing with China. So we can put on sanctions on China. We can hold China accountable economically without a fear of repercussions on our markets because we are solidified with Canada and Mexico. So we are in a very good place economically to deal with China and Chinese hostility.
Yeah, and I really like that. I like the new rules. I like that we looked at digital because that's something that really wasn't a thing, when we started with the NAFTA trade agreement all those years ago. Also, the place of origin playing a big part in tariffs and so forth. One of the other things,
Rose, there's also, I should just mention too, I mean, you were talking about digital. There's also IP protections. And I feel that in the past, we haven't paid as much attention on IP. But in today's market, it's incredibly important. So there's intellectual property protections, which is important to us. And then talking about small businesses, a lot of red tape is cut with this deal that will make it easier for our small businesses to navigate trade with Canada and Mexico, which is a huge win for our small business. So I could talk on and on about USMCA, but it clearly corrects some of the problems we had with NAFTA.
yes.
And is a really good step forward in free and fair trade dealings between our two largest trading partners.
I think it's really important to mention too that we have the support in this trade deal from the AFLCIO, which is huge, really.
Yes. Well, you're seeing a realignment in a lot of our bases, and you're seeing that President Trump and this administration, he's actually watching out for blue collar workers. For generations, a generation or two, Democrats tried to say that they cared about our blue collar workers. It was completely nonsense because NAFTA really sold them out. You have a president now that is really taking them into account and putting them in the equation. And that's why we have so many blue collar workers joining our party, not only from the AFL-CIO, but also the trade unions. They know that the Democrats have made promises and have not kept promises for generations. This president is making promises and keeping those promises.
Even in spite of everything that's going on, the resistance, the criticisms, everything that's happening, he continues to move forward in ways that are very positive for this country. And it's a shame that that's never talked about in the mainstream media.
Well, luckily we have media outlets like you, Rose, and Talk Radio, Fox News, Newsmax, you name it. We have a diverse media, which is really good because we can get the truth out there. This isn't the 1980s and 1990s where we had a few news outlets that just parroted the Democrat talking points. We have a wide array of sources, and that really helps get truth and information out to the public.
You know, I'd like to move on to Hong Kong, if you don't mind. What's happening there? They had the police made their first arrest under the new law. I think the person was carrying a flag that called for Hong Kong's independence, and he was arrested. It's important that we watch what's happening there for many, many reasons, and I'm sure that you can share those with your constituents in the 14th District.
Well, what we're seeing happening in Hong Kong is an absolute assault on freedom and democracy. And Hong Kong is a thriving democracy. They have a representative government. It's really a city-state of people that live free and have free markets. And the Chinese Communist Party is deciding to ignore international agreements that the Chinese Communist Party had with Great Britain. And so that's one thing to remember, is that the CCP will not honor these deals they have with other nations. But we're seeing Hong Kong and their rights getting eroded. And this security law allows the CCP to arrest individuals who speak poorly about the Chinese Communist Party in mainland China. And from what I'm being told this week, it's retroactive. It's also extraterritorial, meaning that it just doesn't apply to Chinese citizens and citizens of Hong Kong. It could apply to foreigners who made statements in Hong Kong. So, I would be applicable under this law. If I went to mainland China or Hong Kong, I could be arrested theoretically, because I've been very critical about the Chinese Communist Party and their transgressions on Hong Kong. But, the sick irony of all this is, Rose, is for the last few weeks, the Democrats have been talking about this fake autonomous zone in Seattle. And they've been giving a lot of fanfare to this fake autonomous zone in Seattle, which we can talk about. But as we have this fake autonomous zone in Seattle, we have a real autonomous zone in Hong Kong. That was the original autonomous zone. It's an autonomous city-state that has all the rights and privileges of Western democracy. And yet, instead of focusing on Hong Kong, the Democrats want to ignore it, pay lip service to it, but do nothing to hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable for their transgressions.
Yeah, and that's a shame. I mean, there's a lot of the Democrats have a lot to be ashamed of. I'll tell you right now, they really do. Their focus has been always in the wrong direction, when we need their focus here and focus on what's happening in our country, in fact. And you brought up Seattle. There's been 32 arrests now in Seattle because the police are retaking that East Precinct. I mean, it's about time, for God's sake. I mean, they should have never allowed it to happen in the first place. There have been people have been killed within that zone, and it's just it's unbelievable to me that we allowed it to get as far as and for as long as it has.
Well, it wasn't us that allowed this to go so far. It was really the political negligence of the individuals in Seattle and the elected government in Seattle. How would you like to be a business that was on Capitol Hill and you were being extorted by this communist militia to pay them in order to operate within the autonomous zone? How would you like to be an individual? To me, that autonomous zone is the epitome of what the Democrats, what their policies will generate. It will be lawlessness, and the law that they do have will be dispensed by a communist militia, just like we saw this devolve. It's really sad what happened in Seattle, but it only stopped when the individuals that were the so-called leaders of CHAZ started to make threats on the mayor of Seattle. So how ironic is that? If you're a business owner, the mayor isn't there to have your back. If you're the police that want to go in and clear this out, the Democrats and that party is nowhere to be found. If you're an individual that was getting harmed in that autonomous zone, and the Seattle police chief said herself, you're talking about rapes, murders, and all kind of violent acts in that autonomous zone. The Democrats were nowhere to be found. But it was when the autonomous zone leaders threatened the mayor that the mayor then took action. That tells you everything you need to know about this new Democrat Party. They care about one thing and one thing only, themselves.
They
And
do.
their policies lead to what you saw in the autonomous zone.
So, Congressman, when you look at what's
Yeah.
going on right now all across the country, and considering that we have a presidential election just right around the corner, really, how do you think the American people are viewing what's happening? Do they understand the lawlessness? Do they understand who it is that can bring law and order and can restore this economy? Even, just as important is our economy. And I think had it not been as strong as it was going into COVID, we could have never withstood what we did. But if this happens again with any other person in charge, I can't believe that we can restore the economy to any degree.
Well, Rose, let me answer that by just looking ahead at the challenges we're going to have in the next not only few months but the next few years. Let's talk about the economy. You have a president who wants to keep the economy moving. You had the hottest economy
Yes.
in history, the lowest unemployment rates in history. And President Trump did that because he cut taxes, he reduced regulation. Look at Joe Biden and his solutions. What Joe Biden wants is more regulation. He wants more taxes. He said this week that he wants to do away with the tax cuts that President Trump had. President Trump wants to move in the opposite direction. So when it comes to the economy, who do you trust? A tax and spend liberal, Joe Biden, who will crush the economy, or a businessman, Donald Trump, who's already proven his economic policies actually work because we had the strongest economy of all time in this country before COVID-19. Now
Yes.
let's look at China. Who do you trust to hold China accountable? Is
Yeah.
it going to be President Trump, who's been
Right.
very bullish on China and has been the first president who's actually held China accountable and deemed them an adversary publicly? Is it President Trump, or is it Joe Biden, who has been very soft on China? Remember that Hunter Biden went over to China and had a great deal worked out where Joe Biden made a small fortune, or Hunter Biden made a small fortune. So you want somebody with that legacy, who was asleep at the wheel when he was vice president for 8 years and we let China grow to the extent that it has? Or do you want President Trump, who's been very forceful on China? And then let's just talk about law and order. Do you want somebody who actually wants to do something to end illegal immigration, who wants to end the dangerous policy of sanctuary cities? Do you want somebody who's actually taking a stand to protect statues and national monuments and monuments that memorialize the U.S. soldier? Do you want that in President Trump, or do you want Joe Biden, someone who has willingly turned a blind eye to this chaos? And I would say his party has actually encouraged the riots, has encouraged the looting. So the decision that we have to make is very clear. I believe that the American people will choose the economy, they'll choose to hold China accountable, and they'll choose law and order over Joe Biden and liberal nonsense.
I agree with you. I really do. I mean, it's hard to deny any of those things. And then when you have what happened this week with the USMCA, with so many people in favor of it, with it boosting the auto industry and the agricultural industry, and having that union behind it and supporting it, it tells me clearly that people understand what the nuts and bolts are in this election.
It absolutely does, Rose. And as we're seeing, the Democrat Party is going the way of the Whig Party. This party is disintegrating before its own eyes. And it's being replaced by these social justice warriors. And it's really a party that's becoming a party of spoiled rich kids and coastal elites. That's really what their party has become. The blue collar workers, the everyday American, they are going with President Trump, the Republican Party, and the Democrat Party is no longer the party of JFK. It's no longer your grandfather's Democrat Party. This is a rabid socialist party, and what you see in CHAZ is the new Democrat Party. That is the social justice warrior Democrat that has replaced your old blue dog Democrats.
Exactly. Well said. Well said. Real quick, I know that you were working on the task force, the China task force, and looking into their complicity and everything that went on during COVID, and some of the other things where we are so fully dependent on China for a lot of our prescriptions and so forth. What's going on right now there? Just curious. A lot of people have asked me about that.
There's a lot going on with China, and luckily Republican leader McCarthy, has started the China task force. It's 15 Republicans. We're led by ranking member Mike McCall. He's our chairman. He's the ranking member on foreign affairs. I'm fortunate enough to be on that task force, as I said. But we are taking a look at China, and I'm very troubled by the actions of China. It seems like, sadly, this has become an issue that only Republicans care about. But we have got to hold China accountable for, I believe, I believe, negligence in allowing COVID-19 and this virus to spread around the world. We've got to take a look at our supply chains because we are far too dependent on China. So we've got to move our supply chains back home, and we've got to take a look at ways to protect ourselves because I don't think this is the last of pandemics that arise from China. I think that this could happen again, and next time it happens, we've got to be better prepared. And we do that by drawing business back to the United States. I want to use an approach where we cut taxes, reduce regulations, make the United States a place that people want to do business in again and move those supply chains back home. At the same time, we can never again allow China to monopolize and take advantage of our international institutions like they did it with the World Health Organization. So there's a lot to talk about on China and the China Task Force. That's just some of the things that we're working on. And just this week, Rose, I was very fortunate. I was in a very small meeting with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. We were talking about these same issues. We were talking about supply chains, Hong Kong, China wanting to take over Taiwan. This is an issue that we're going to have to deal with in the next few decades. Just as terrorism has dominated for the last 20 years, China will dominate our discussions because they're a rising power and they're certainly an adversarial power to the United States and Western democracies.